And the lesson after this one, we're going to start solving inequalities, which is like solving an equation, except one little minor detail. But before we get into that lesson, I wanted to have an introduction lesson on your less thans and your greater than signs, because lots of students struggle with that. And we're also going to look at something called interval notation in this lesson, and you've never seen interval notation before, so that is going to be something brand new to you. All right, so let's talk about these signs because students really struggle with them. So when you just see them without any variables or any numbers, this is a less than symbol, and this is a less than or equal to symbol. But once you start throwing in variables and numbers, people don't know how to read it. So if I wanted to write x is less than 3, this is one way of writing it. The other way of writing it is this. Both of these say x is less than 3. X is less than 3. So what I need you to be aware of, because it's going to be very important in the next few lessons, that you're able to read these when the x is on the left and when the x is on the right. Okay, so what you need to know is that when the pointed end is facing the variable, so the little pointed end of the symbol, so when the pointed end is facing the variable, that is less than. Okay, and that's because the alligator eats the bigger guy. So that means the 3 is the bigger guy, so x is the lesser guy. So that's why this says x is less than 3. And same thing over here. The alligator's eating the bigger number, so 3 is the bigger guy, which means x is the lesser guy. So that's why it says x is less than 3. So if the pointed end faces the variable, that's less than, and less than shades to the left. Less than shades to the left. If there is an equal symbol, we close the circle, and if there's not an equal symbol, it's an open circle. And we'll practice that as we go. Okay, when you just see these symbols the way they are, without any variables or numbers, this is a greater than sign, and this is a greater than or equal to sign. So if I want to say x is greater than 3, it can look like this, or it can look like this. This says x is greater than 3, and this says x is greater than 3. Remember, the alligator eats the bigger guy, so that means x is greater. The alligator eats the bigger guy, so x is greater. So if the big mouth is facing the variable, then you read it x is greater, and greater shades to the right. And once again, if there's an equals, it's a closed circle, and if there's no equals, it's open. Okay, so for these next pictures, we are going to write the inequality notation, and then what's new to you, the interval notation. All right, so these numbers that are shaded, they're bigger than 6. So I say x is greater than 6. Because it's an open circle, I don't put an equal sign. Okay, so that is the inequality notation. These greater thans and less thans, those are called inequalities, so that's inequality notation. Now, interval notation, this is what you've never seen. Interval notation involves infinity, positive infinity, negative infinity. Well, as you go to the right, you get bigger, 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 which means you're headed to positive infinity. So this picture starts at a 6, comma, and it goes to positive infinity. Now, because this is an open circle, you're going to use a parenthesis. That means you don't equal the 6, so the parenthesis indicates that you don't equal the 6. Now, you can never equal infinity because you can't ever get to infinity. You can always get a little bigger, 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 bigger. So because you can't ever equal infinity, infinity will always have a parenthesis. And this is interval notation, and this is inequality notation. And they both represent this picture. Okay, it'll take a little getting used to. So let's just keep trying. All right, this one. These numbers that are shaded are to the left of the -4. So you're getting smaller, 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 smaller. So we say x is less than -4. Because it's a closed circle, It equals the -4, so we're going to put an equal symbol there. So that is inequality notation. Now, let's talk about interval. As you go smaller, 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 you're headed to negative infinity. So one thing about interval notation, it's always the smaller number first and the bigger number last. So between a negative infinity and a -4, negative infinity is smaller. So negative infinity goes first, and the shading goes all the way up to -4. So -4 goes last. Okay, if there's a closed circle, that means it equals the number. So to represent an equal sign, we give a bracket. But because you can't ever equal infinity, then that always stays a parenthesis. Okay, so open circles are parentheses, closed circles are brackets. But infinity, you can never get to infinity, positive infinity or negative infinity. So infinities are always parentheses. Okay, let's look at the next one. The shading starts here at the 4 and goes left, so they get smaller, smaller, smaller. So that is x is less than 4. Because it's an open circle, there's no equals. Okay, that's inequality notation. Now let's try interval. Because you're going left, 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 you're getting smaller and smaller and smaller, so you're headed to negative infinity. Okay, so when you do the interval notation, it's always smallest to biggest. So negative infinity goes first, and 4 goes last. Because it's an open circle at the 4, it's a parenthesis, and because you can never equal infinity, it's a parenthesis. And that's your interval notation. Okay, this one starts at -1 and the shading goes to the right, so the numbers are getting greater. So x is greater than -1, and because of the closed circle, it gets an equals. So that's inequality notation. Now let's try interval. As you go to the right, you get bigger, 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 bigger. So this time you're headed to positive infinity. Well, it's smaller number, bigger number, so it's -1, comma, infinity. Closed circles get brackets. So whenever you equal something, it gets a bracket. But you can't equal infinity, so it's always a parenthesis. So infinity and negative infinity are always parentheses. Okay, what do you think? Hopefully not too bad. All right, these here, I'm not going to make an elaborate number line. I'm just going to put the number in question. So it says x is, and we have to know how to read this. If the pointed end faces the variable, it says less. So x is less than 3. So I'm going to put 3 on the number line. It will be an open circle because there's no equal sign. And then less, x is less than 3. I want to shade everything less than 3, and less is left. So I shade everything to the left. Okay, let's try the next one, and then I'll come back and do interval notation. So I have to know how to read this. So m is, the big mouth is facing the variable, so this is greater. So m is greater than or equal to -5. So I'm going to put -5, and it's going to get a closed circle this time. So if there's an equals, it gets a closed circle. If there's no equals, it's open. So m is greater than, and greater is always to the right. So less is to the left, less than left, less than left, but greater is to the right. Now, let's try to do interval notation for these. So interval notation, this one is going left, 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 so it's getting smaller, smaller, smaller to negative infinity, whereas this one's going right, 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 so it's getting bigger, 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 bigger to positive infinity. So smaller number, bigger number, so negative infinity, comma 3. Open circles are parentheses, and infinities are parentheses, because you can't equal infinity. Okay, smaller number, bigger number, so -5, comma, infinity. Closed circles are brackets, but you can never equal infinity, so parenthesis. Okay, now this next one might be a little bit harder. You always read from the variable. I know you're going to want to read from left to right, but you always read from the variable. So see how the pointed end is facing it? So if the pointed end faces the variable, it says x is less. Remember, if the pointed end faces the variable, it's less than. All right, so this says x is less than -4. So I put -4. Will it be an open or a closed circle? Open. And if it says x is less, less is left. Let's try the next one and then we'll do interval notation. Okay, so start by reading from your variable. Do you see how the big mouth faces it this time? So if the big mouth faces it, that means he's greater. So this is x is greater. So this is x is greater than or equal to 3. Okay, so I'm going to put 3 on my number line. Open or closed circle? Closed. And x is greater. So greater is to the right. So you shade everything to the right. Okay, let's try interval notation. So when you go left, you get smaller, 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 headed to -infinity. When you go right, you get bigger, 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 headed to +infinity. So smaller number, bigger number. So -infinity, comma -4. The -4, what do you think? Parenthesis or bracket? Open circle is a parenthesis. And infinity, parenthesis, because you can't equal infinity. So it's always a parenthesis. It will never be a bracket. The bracket indicates you equal something. Okay, smaller number, bigger number. So 3, comma, infinity. What's the 3 going to get? A bracket. And what do you think about the infinity? A parenthesis. Okay, so that is interval notation. Okay, so now we're going to look at what are called compound inequalities. These are and or problems, which you're going to learn more about in another day or so. So compound inequalities are and or problems. They're and problems or they're or problems. Okay, and this is what the graphs of compound inequalities look like. Just so you know, when the shading is in between two numbers, that's an and. So this is an and. But when the shading jets off into two separate directions, those are or problems. So this is an or problem. Jets off into two different directions, that's an or problem. If the shading's between, that's an and problem. Shading's in between, that's an and problem, which you'll learn more about later. But it's good to know a little bit about it now. Okay, so the first one, the inequality notation. Now this might be a little confusing to you, and that's just because some people really struggle with the signs. So the numbers that are shaded are between -1 and 3. So I'm going to put x between -1 and 3, just like the shading is in between -1 and 3. Okay, now the symbols, this is where people get confused. Okay, so as you go to, when you're at the -1, as you go to the right, you get bigger. So you want to say that the x's get bigger than -1. So if you want to say x's get bigger than -1, you have to put the big mouth facing the x, because that says x is greater than -1. But when you're here at the 3 and you go left, you're getting smaller. So you want to say the x's are getting smaller than 3. So you have to put the pointed end facing the x, so it says x's are smaller than 3. Because these are both open circles, then there's no equal signs. And that's inequality notation. So inequality notation always puts the smaller number on the left and the bigger number on the right, and the symbols should always look like that. As long as the smaller number is on the left and the bigger number is on the right. Now, interval notation for this one is really easy. This problem doesn't go to infinity at all. There's no shading forever to the right. There's no shading forever to the left. The shading's just between -1 and 3. So interval notation is -1, 3. And then because they're both open circles, they both have parentheses. And that's the interval notation. So this time the interval notation is a little easier. Okay, let's try another and. Let's look at 12. So in this one, the shading's between 1 and 4. So I'm going to put x between 1 and 4. Okay, when you're here at the 1 and you go to the right, you get bigger. So I want to say x gets bigger than 1. So I put the big mouth facing the x. So it says x is greater than 1. When you're here at the 4 and go left, you're getting smaller. So I want to say x is less than 4. So I have to put the pointed end facing the variable, so it says x is less than 4. And then, because the 4 has a closed circle, it gets an equals. But the 1 is open, so no equals. So once again, smaller number on the left, bigger number on the right. That's how the signs look. Okay, interval notation. There's no infinities because there's no shading forever to the right or no shading forever to the left. The shading's just between 1 and 4. So it's just 1, 4. Which one gets the bracket? The 4 gets the bracket. So closed circles are brackets and open circles are parentheses. Okay. Now, 10 and 11, these are OR problems. So they'll actually have the word OR in them. All right, so the OR problems, I write an inequality for that, and then I write an inequality for that. So these are numbers less than -1. So x is less than -1. Because of the closed circle, it gets an equals. Or these numbers are bigger than 1. X is greater than 1. And because of the open circle, there's no equals. Now, the inequality notation is a little bit funky on this one. We're going to have two separate ones, just like we did here, and then we have a symbol to represent the OR. So this time, you do have infinity because you're going forever to the left, so that's negative infinity. And here you're going forever to the right, which is going to positive infinity. So it's smaller number, bigger number. So it's from negative infinity to -1. So negative infinity to -1. And then it picks back up at 1, and it goes to positive infinity. Remember, infinities are always parentheses. Closed circles are always brackets. Open circles are always parentheses. And then we have this, it's called a union symbol. It's a little U, and it represents the break in the graph. Because there's no shading from here to here, then that's what this U represents. It represents the shading, the break in the graph. It's kind of like the word OR. And that is the interval notation. It's going to take a little getting used to, I know. Okay, let's try this one. So here, these numbers are less than 3, so x is less than 3. Or these numbers are bigger than 5. X is greater than 5. But because of the closed circle, it needs an equals. Okay, now let's try the interval notation. So this one goes forever to the left, heading to negative infinity. This one goes forever to the right, heading to positive infinity. So remember, smaller number, bigger number. So negative infinity, 3. Infinities are always parentheses. Open circles are always parentheses. And then to represent the break in the graph where there's no shading, you use a union symbol. And then it starts back up at 5 and goes to infinity. So 5, infinity. Infinities are always parentheses. Closed circles are always brackets. And that's your interval notation. Are you kind of getting it? Do you kind of understand? Okay, now we're going to try to graph some of our own. So let's look at this here. Okay, so when it's all smushed together like that, that's an and problem. And that's when the shading is in between, typically. There are some exceptions. So the smaller number goes on the left, the bigger number goes on the right. Because there's no equal signs, they both get open circles. Okay, so this is telling you you want to shade numbers that are greater than -2, so greater than -2 that way, and numbers that are less than 3. So the only places that you're greater than -2 and less than 3 is in the middle. So most of your and problems look like that, but there are exceptions. Sometimes they can look differently. So when you do an and, you can only shade where both things are true at the same time. So you had to be bigger than this guy, but less than this one. Okay, interval notation, that's easy for this. There's no infinities. The shading's just between -2 and 3. So it's just -2, 3. They're both open circles, so they're both parentheses. Okay, let's come over here and try the other and. So the smaller number, -4, goes on the left, and the bigger number 3 goes on the right. Now this time they both have equal signs, so this time they're both going to be closed circles. So it says you want numbers greater than -4, so that's this way. And then you want numbers less than 3, that's this way. So greater than this one, but less than this one. And that happens right in the middle. Okay, interval notation, the shading's just between -4 and 3, so it's -4, 3. And then close circles, get brackets. Okay, now let's look at our ors. So the thing about the ors is you basically just graph the left inequality, and then you graph the right inequality, and however it looks, it looks. Okay, so -3 is my smaller number, and it says x is less than -3. So less is to the left, and it's an open circle. 2 is my bigger number, so it goes farther on the right, and this says x is greater than or equal to 2. So this would be a closed circle, and greater is to the right. And this is typically how the OR problems look, but there are exceptions. So I might show you that in another day or so. Okay, inequality notation. This time we've got infinities. So this is headed to what kind of infinity? Negative. So it's going from -infinity to -3. So infinities are parentheses, open circles are parentheses. The break in the graph, where there's no shading, that's our union symbol. Sorry, I didn't mean to mark my paper there. So there is no shading in the middle there, so that's the union. And then the shading picks back up at 2, and it goes forever right, 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 which is positive infinity. Infinities are parentheses, closed circles are brackets. Okay, and let's try this one. 0 is the smaller number, so I'll put it on the left. All right, and 2 is the bigger number, so I'll just go ahead and put it on the right. So this says x is less than or equal to 0. So closed circle and less than's left. This says x is greater than 2. So open circle and shade to the right. Once again, anytime you go forever to the left, that's negative infinity that it's going to. So negative infinity to 0. Infinities are always parentheses. Closed circles are always brackets. The shading in the middle that you don't see, where there's the break in the graph, that's the union symbol. And then the shading picks back up at 2 and goes forever to the right, which is going to positive infinity. Infinities are always parentheses, and open circles are always parentheses. And that is interval notation. Okay, that's all for this lesson. Smiley face!